Good morning. This is Dr. Mike, and I wanted to spend some time with you this morning talking about some things about the history that we are engaging in Western civilization. I try to do this once a week. I call it from my perspective because I want to kind of give you some background and some context that you may miss in just the materials you get from your book as to why we do what we do as a historian, and hopefully those will be things will be helpful to you as we move forward through the course. Western civilization is interesting because it is basically our heritage and how our thought patterns and our lives have come to develop in the way that they have. But you understand that when we talk about Western civilization, that we are not talking about everything in the world. There are other histories that are even longer than Western civilization that we tend to ignore in the West and do not incorporate into our historical thinking. For instance, the East, mainly China and Japan, when you think of those areas, have a much longer history and illustrious history than did the Western world. They were ancient in when Rome was just starting and Greece was starting. That they had years and years of experience thinking about things, and they had very separate religions. Most of the Eastern religions will differ tremendously from the West because we tend to be monotheistic, and they would tend to be much more Buddhist, Hinduist, those kind of religions, basically believing in reincarnation and those different beliefs that kind of set them apart from the world. And you can actually take a course in any one of those in one of those histories. Currently, there has been a shift towards teaching world history, and I've done that several times, in which we try to incorporate what's going on in the world. At the same time, we're talking about the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians and the Hebrews. But in this particular course, we're dealing just with Western civilization. And so it's good for you to know that there is a difference, that there are countries or other areas that we don't deal with. We don't deal much with Russian history, with Indian history, with Chinese history, Japanese history. We're dealing mainly with what we would today consider to be the Middle Eastern countries in that area around the Mediterranean, and then how that influenced and shaped the West as we move westward, ultimately ending up in the what's now the United States. And so basically, that is one of the important things for us to understand. The second thing that I wanted to make note of is where we start in this course and the reason for that. We basically start with the Sumerians because they are the first people to write down things. And writing becomes such a great of great importance to history because we cannot analyze things that we don't have records for. And so, for that reason, anything before the Sumerians is not included in a Western civilization textbook. Now, in a Christian school, in a Christian environment, we also realize that the Bible has something to say about what happened before the Sumerians. And of course, the first five books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we take those by faith because we don't have written records. The Bible, that part of the Bible was written much later, we think, by Moses, who dictated it to a scribe, but it was handed down by oral traditions from that time until it was written down in the wilderness while the children of Israel were on their way uh, to the promised land. That doesn't mean it's not true. It means that there's some things we take by written records and physical artifacts, and then there's some that we take by faith. And so, just to kind of give you a perspective on that, it's important to understand there's nothing wrong with our faith, and there's nothing wrong with us taking that. Just we understand why there is a difference. There's not factual artifacts and data that actually we can go to when we talk about the first five books of the Bible, especially the Genesis story, the flood story. And we do have some facts about a universal flood. And of course, that is an entire area of Christian thought today. The creation and the flood; they're trying to build scientifically the facts to make it much more acceptable in the world of science than it is. And of course, that varies with people and thinking. So I just want to kind of get your thinking wrapped around that so that you can understand where we draw those lines of difference. This week, we are talking about what we would normally call the cradles of civilization. This is where people began to live together and to work together. Prior to this, they are what we would call hunters and gatherers. They lived in smaller groups and they spent their time gathering food, and the livelihood was much more nomadic. One of the interesting things that have been found recently in recent years in studying nomadic groups like the Aborigines in Australia, we would normally think that hunting and gathering would take all of your time. I mean, you'd work 7 days a week to find enough food to subsist. But what they have really found is that hunters and gatherers in that society had more leisure time and free time than probably any other group of people in history. It normally would take about 2.5 days for hunters and gatherers to gather enough food to exist for a week. And so the rest of the time was leisure, whatever they did as far as for recreation or whatever. So that's an interesting point. As we move from hunting and gathering into slash and burn agriculture and then later into subsistence agriculture, the amount of time that it takes to live becomes much more intense. If you've ever lived on a farm, you realize the truth of that there's always something to be done on a farm. There's never a time when you have all your work done and there's just absolutely nothing to do. So the more they move toward farming and settling down, the more intense the labor becomes. Having said that, also, subsistence farming allowed civilizations to begin to gather. Not everyone had to go out and look for food every day. And so there was this leeway then to begin to exist in larger groups, and of course, then in towns and cities, which we're looking at when we look at these civilizations around the rivers. They grew up around rivers for a particular reason or reasons. Number one, travel would have been one of those. It's easier to travel on the water long distances than it is to walk. The other thing that is driving these civilizations, I think, is religion. It's much easier to have religious worship with larger groups of people than it is to say with your family. I know sometimes as Christians we've had to have home services, maybe the weather, or now with COVID, all these things that go on in our lives, that we have private worship, family worship. And having been a pastor for 20 years, I'm here to tell you it's very difficult to have worship just with a small group of people. So as they begin to live together, they're able to produce more things outside of just gathering food. So they're able to build cities, and they're able to, make metal work and all those things. But they're also able to enlarge on religious worship. So many of these ancient civilizations that we're talking about will have a huge ziggurat in the center of them, which was nothing more than a gigantic altar with steps going up it. And on top, they would offer their sacrifices. Many times at this stage would have been human sacrifices in these early days. Now, keep in mind also that if we accept the Genesis account of the creation, that everybody on the planet came from two parents, Adam and Eve. So everyone started with the same requisite knowledge of religion and the one true God and all those ideas. And as they spread out and covered the ends of the earth, those ideas would change. The further away you are from the center, the more outliers you have. And that's what Romans chapter 1 talks about, that because they did not want to retain God in their minds, that God gave them up. It says 3 times in chapter 1 that he gave them up, or he gave them over to do things not pleasing to the flesh. He gave them over, and finally he gave them up to allow them to go out. And they developed their own religions and got away from the belief of the one true God. So there's a lot of things in there to be considered as we think about this period before the writing down. So with the Sumerians, and these are the beginning of peoples living together around rivers. So we look at the cradle of civilization basically as the Nile River and Egypt and the Tigris and Euphrates and what is today Iraq, and the Indus River in India and the Yangtze River in China. And these were the first places that people began to live together in larger and larger groups and to build cities and to develop cultures that will lead into what is now we will consider to be Western civilization. So those are things are important. And so it's important for us to understand that is the root of what we're talking about, because water is absolutely essential to life, and having large groups of people require large amounts of water, not only for religious worship, but for purification, for cleansing, for washing, for cooking, everything else that goes along with that. So this is where we start with history. Let me say something about history in general, because I think that history may be different than what you have conceived it to be. Many of you are coming from high school backgrounds where we talk about a very limited view of history, especially American history, and Benjamin Franklin called it civic history. He said we have this story that we tell ourselves about ourselves that we use in nation building. And you have noticed, even with high school history, things that have been left out. We have barely 2 pages in a textbook of Native American history, even though they'd been here thousands of years before the first European settlers arrived. We have very few pages of women's history or of Asian history or anything else that contributes to the story. But we tell this very narrow story, basically, of how white men came from Europe and built America, and we ignore all the other things. Well, history, when you get to the college level, we begin to explore much broader, and we realize that there's more than one story. That we like to tell the story that makes us look good. History is a very biased operation. Anytime you read a book of history, you need to ask yourself, what is this guy trying to sell me? Because as historians, when we write books, it's going to always be affected by our own bias, the things that we see and we feel. So when you go to a historical excavation and you dig, you're looking at things from your perspective, trying to prove a point that you have made. And it's not very objective sometimes. And so when we find this stone, instead of looking at this stone from a non-biased position, we tend to want to put that into place into the story that we're telling. And so you'll find many historians will tell different stories about the same evidence. And so as a historian, you have to take out the things you've been taught. And most of us get our history from our grandparents and from the History Channel, from television programs, from cartoons, whatever. You have to take your preconceived ideas out and lay them on the table and examine them in light of the evidence that we have to see if the conclusions that you hold to are really the conclusions that are valid and are supported by the evidence. If they are not, you chuck your theory and come up with a new theory. So basically, it's very, very important. Archaeology, which has been a great tool of history, was mainly invented to try to prove the Bible in the 1800s in the face of German textual criticism, which was raising questions about the validity and the truth of Scripture. And so they invented archaeology. And it basically went on mostly in the Middle East. And I've worked on those excavations. I've visited many of them as far north as Damascus, where when they found something, they wanted to fit it into the biblical narrative as a way of supporting the Bible. For instance, I was in northern Syria in 1980 at an excavation called Ebla or Tel Mardik, and the Arabs there had uncovered a library with 5,000 clay tablets. And there again, the writing issue is big. But they found in that writing mentions of David and Solomon and Abraham, which gave the Jews such a prior claim to the land of Israel that instead of realigning their storyline, they simply put all that stuff back in the ground and covered it up and put a missile silo on top of it. So those are the kind of things you run into in history where people are determined to tell their own story, regardless of whether it matches the facts or not. And so history is a weapon, just like religion is a weapon that we wield in the culture wars. So it's very important that you have a balanced approach as possible. So as we go through these things, I hope that you will find some things that we talk about from week to week and we read about that you want to put into your narrative and piece together your view of the Western world to understand how we came to be the people that we are today. I'm always open to questions. I'm very happy to engage in dialogue with you as my student. And I would love to hear your questions and your comments. And hopefully this perspective each week will kind of help you to find your way through this course. Many of you have said that you don't have a large history background, but I hope you'll leave this course feeling differently about that, that now you know something. You may not understand the entire picture, but you can wrap your mind around this piece of it at least and realize the realities of what we are trying to accomplish here. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again.